3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about Phase 16, World War I. So going back about 100 years ago, society had entered a new era in history, a world forever changed by the effects of the earlier Industrial Revolution, and a world where industries only continued to develop more and more with new innovations and increased trade, creating a more globalized world. Science would also continue to develop, especially the human understanding of the universe, thanks to scientists like Albert Einstein, who made world-changing discoveries regarding the human understanding of the universe, determining that the laws of physics were the same throughout the entire universe. However, all of these human developments would be overshadowed, unfortunately, by warfare. Because though societies have become more developed and interconnected via trade, empires were still trying to get more and more influence in the world, and the hunger for more global power, driven by ethnic nationalism, continued. In turn, the newly industrialized world would find itself in a new type of warfare as a result, and one that no one could have ever imagined would be so destructive. Because at the end of the day, this was not just a normal war between a couple empires battling for territory, or even a war isolated to nations from a particular region of the world. This was a war that involved nations all across the planet, showing just how drastically the world had changed and how much more connected it had become. So this infamous event began in 1914 and was known as World War I. The major players in this war were the Central Powers, which included dictatorships like the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey. And they were against an alliance generally based around democratic ideals called the Allied Powers, which represented the French Empire, the British Empire, and later the United States of America, as well as one non-democracy, the Russian Empire, which was a monarchy, but would leave the war about a year before it ended because of the Russian Revolution. So this brings us to the big question, how on earth did such a tragic event happen? Well, it all began about 100 years ago in 1914 when the Austrian Archduke and heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Franz Ferdinand, nephew of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, was assassinated by the plot of the head of Serbia's military intelligence, who was a Serbian nationalist who had the goal of creating a larger and more powerful Serbian nation. And he wanted to do this by getting control of what is modern-day Bosnia, which had a good number of Serbians living there, but was controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. In fact, it was only a few years earlier that Bosnia became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after the war in which Serbia and Montenegro fought against the Ottoman Empire for control of Bosnia. Because before Austro-Hungarian Empire had gotten control of it, it had belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And so this tension over Bosnia just kept going, and it started to amount to tension between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire after it was no longer in the Ottoman Empire's hands. Thus, this assassination had a domino effect across Europe, because all these empires had their own strategic interests to protect, and they all had their own alliances. And because of this went from a conflict just between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire to a worldwide problem. For instance, after the incident, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. Unfortunately, though, the Russian Empire was a Serbian ally and joined the war to protect Serbia. Then Germany declared war on Russia to protect their ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Next, Germany declared war on the French Empire after France refused to promise they would be neutral in the war, because France was an ally of the Russian Empire. And Germany then asked neutral Belgium to let them through to get to the French Empire, but they refused, wanting nothing to do with the war. And as a result, Germany then invaded Belgium to get to France. And the British Empire then would declare war on Germany because they were allies with Belgium and France. And the Ottoman Empire, who were allies with Germany, joined the war as well. And later, the United States of America joins the war after remaining neutral for most of the war and declared war on Germany. So you have all these crazy complex alliances where all these different countries are supporting one another and basically picking sides in this conflict that keeps growing bigger and bigger. Now, the US entering the war was a big deal, and the way it started was because the British Empire during the war started to stop trade ships from nations which weren't involved in the conflict from bringing supplies to Germany. And in response, German ships started sinking ships bringing supplies to the British Empire, and this included American ships and even ships off the coast of America that were going to bring supplies. And this naturally upset Americans quite a bit. And the anger of Americans only grew greater because Germany then was revealed to try to convince Mexico to join the war to fight America, even promising Mexico that they could regain control of some of their lost territories to America if they helped them in the war. Thus, at this point, America was pretty upset and joined the war, allying with the British Empire and the French Empire and the Russian Empire temporarily until Russia left the war. So the impact of the US entering the war really can't be stressed enough. This was an absolutely huge boost for the Allies because before the US entered the war, it didn't seem possible for the Allies to defeat the Central Powers. In fact, even as the US was just starting to get involved, Germany and the other Central Powers were looking like they could win, with the European allies struggling to fight off Germany, and with the Russian Empire collapsing due to the Russian Revolution and quitting the war. And all of a sudden, Germany no longer had to fight a war in Eastern and Western Europe. Because with Russia gone, they could turn all their effort into Western Europe fighting France and Britain, as well as the US. Now, an additional fact as to why Russia ended up leaving the war due to the Russian Revolution was that Germany actually played a bit of a role in helping cause chaos in Russia, which would eventually cause the Russian Revolution, because Russian revolutionaries who were exiled from Russia, kicked out of the country because of their ideals, like Vladimir Lenin, were brought back into the country by Germany, and they then helped cause this revolution. So, turning back to America's role in the war, the American economic and military boost to the Allies changed the war, despite the big obstacles the Allies had to overcome. And as a result, the Allies started to begin winning the war. And by 1918, 4 years into the war, the Allies had defeated the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, once the Central Powers began to realize that the war was not winnable. So now turning to the results of the war, from here, Britain, France, and the United States of America decided what would happen next with the Central Powers that had lost. And this would lead to the creation of the Treaty of Versailles, which made Germany accept all the blame for the cause of war. They had to pay the damages of the war. They had to have a strict limitation on the size of their military. Parts of Germany was taken away, and they lost all their colonies throughout the world. And the German Empire could no longer exist. And lastly, they were not allowed to be part of the League of Nations, which was the main international diplomatic organization of the world, like today's modern United Nations. And the goal of these very harsh restrictions on Germany was to make sure that Germany was never a threat to Europe ever again. In addition, as a result of the war, the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, though not punished like Germany, were also no longer allowed to exist, and so their empires would collapse as well. But turning back to Germany and their punishment, this was ultimately a diplomatic disaster for the world, because it greatly damaged the German economy and the lives of German people, causing enormous anger in Germany. Also, Germany rightfully felt it was not fair to be blamed for the entire war, because in reality, blaming one nation for an entire war that was this complex, that involved so many different nations, was obviously a huge oversimplification of the war and its causes. Since many European empires were to blame for the war, and there were many opportunities for various nations to prevent the war, or at least prevent the war from becoming so destructive. But international diplomacy ultimately failed. However, with this being said though, Germany certainly deserved a good amount of blame for the war since they were the first to invade another country and were the most aggressive during the war. Thus, you can accurately say that they shouldn't have been blamed for everything, but they certainly had a big part in the war and why it happened. In turn, the next big mistake, beyond just the punishment to Germany, was the fact that the Allies who made the punishment were not truly enforcing their punishment well enough, which allowed an angry Germany to rebuild a powerful military secretly and develop a very dangerous form of German nationalism, which would result in the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, the French and British empires remained, but severely damaged, and the United States of America became the newest world power. So looking back at this war in the big picture, there are many takeaways that we should have. First and foremost, obviously, the death toll of this war in the context of human history was horrific. With over 20 million deaths, making it one of the deadliest in history. But also how much easier it was to kill each other with these new technological advances. For instance, improved rifles and artillery, as well as the invention of the machine gun, made the war into something the world had never seen before. This, along with the fact that trench warfare was very popular during the war, made it even worse because it was very hard to move the enemy out of their positions, and as a result, lots and lots of people were killed, making very little progress during the war. And this was especially true in Western Europe. Thus, what made this war ultimately just so disastrous for human society was that it was this clash of a newly industrialized and technologically advanced world with a more globalized world, combined with the ancient human idea of controlling more territory and having more power and influence in the world in honor of your nation. And this was the recipe for one of the worst wars in history. Because it didn't differ from wars in terms of the goals. The goal was obviously to protect your strategic interests in the world and your influence and power in the world. But the context of those interests had changed so much that war had developed into a much more dangerous and destructive thing for the world. Because simply put, technology was developing faster than military strategy, and this war was deadly because of that. So one of the major lessons to be learned from this war is that as technology develops more and more, warfare becomes deadlier because there's more and more ways that we can kill each other, which makes the ability to compromise even more important and crucial for human survival. Lastly, when thinking about another consequence of this war when it comes to development of societies in the future, it was enormously important because the Allied victory prevented the German Empire's dictatorship from becoming the dominant power in Europe, which would have drastically hurt the societal movement towards democracy in Europe. So thank you for listening, and please feel free to leave a review on iTunes or Facebook. Also, be sure, if you don't already, follow Roots of Reality on social media. Feel free to leave any comments. And as always, remember, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.